I'm up here on my roof. That is downtown San Francisco. Just listened to a video by Professor Anton in response to someone else that was really oversimplifying issues of epistemology. You know, they were pushing for an objective um, form of knowledge of the world, and Corey was pointing out that science is always going to have to deal with the position of the subject in relation to the object, and the way that the subject reveals certain perspectives of the object at the same time that it conceals other perspectives. Subjects are always situated, and the notion of a view from nowhere, sort of Cartesian, um, disinterested, objectifying gaze from beyond the world, of the world, or at the world, is sort of well, it's the myth of modernity, really, the myth of sort of Newtonian science that we once thought was possible. And I want to read a very short article by an anthropologist named Alf Hornborg. And Hornborg is someone whose work I've really learned a lot from, especially his book called The Power of the Machine, which looks at the connections between, well, really everything. It's really a look at global capitalism and the way that it systematically exploits and destroys um, labor, human labor, and ecologies around the planet. Um, he's written an article here on the work of Bruno Latour, a French sociologist of science, who I also have learned a lot from. It's called Animism, Fetishism, and Objectivism as Strategies for Knowing or Not Knowing the World. That's how you spell Hornborg's name. So I'll skip the abstract, and we'll get right to it here. The topic of animism continues to intrigue modern people. What, then, do we mean by modern? As a number of social theorists have suggested, the social condition and technological accomplishments of modernity have been founded on a categorical distinction between nature and society. It is by drawing a boundary between the world of objects and the world of meanings that the modern project has emerged. By, as it were, distilling nature into its material properties alone, uncontaminated by symbolic meanings or social relations, modernists have been freed to manipulate it in ways unthinkable in pre-modern contexts. Animism, of course, suggests the very antithesis of this objectifying modern stance. Yet it is not a phenomenon that can be relegated to a previous period in human history. As Tim Ingold in 2000, Nurit Bird-David in 1999, and Felipe de Scola in 1994, and other anthropologists have shown, many contemporary people who are intimately engaged in gaining their subsistence from local ecosystems continue to approach their non-human environments through what is now being called a relational stance. Entities such as plants or even rocks may be approached as communicative subjects rather than the inert objects perceived by modernists. I would like to discuss the notion of animism from the perspective of what Bruno Latour in 1993 has called a symmetric anthropology, an anthropology that does not merely represent an urban, modern perspective on the pre-moderns in the margins, but that is equally capable of subjecting modern life itself to cultural analysis. For animism raises more questions about ourselves than about the animists. To begin with, is it really true that we, modern Westerners, do not animate the objects around us? And to the extent that we are indeed Cartesianists, whence does this objectifying stance derive? Is it a product of our social organization, our education, our personal biographies? What are the consequences of objectification? For ourselves, for social relations, and for the environment? Finally, why are we asking these questions today, and what relation do they have to actual social and ecological processes in our time? Bruno Latour argues that we have, in fact, never been modern. The notion that the world of objects and the world of subjects are separable in any other than an analytical sense has been an illusion from the start. Not only do human beings everywhere impute personhood and agency to entities which, according to official modernist doctrine, ought to be classified as objects, need I mention our favorite trees, houses, cars, teddy bears, but Latour makes the important point that modernity itself, through the new socio-technical networks unleashed by its dualist epistemology, continually generates ever more obvious examples of hybrids, or quasi-objects, that contain both subjective and objective aspects, and that span the divide between nature and culture. In other words, the official Cartesian ideology of subject-object dualism is not only contradicted in our everyday lives, when applied in social and technological practice, it inexorably produces increasingly conspicuous evidence of its own invalidity. From the ozone hole to genetically modified organisms, the real world afflicted by modernity has shown itself to be not only permeable to, but imbued with, politics, meanings, and human intentions. The new technologies and networks prove to be not objects, but what Latour calls quasi-objects, or hybrids, part nature, part society, and brimming with agency. So if Cartesian dualism has indeed become invalidated by its own technological success, what is there to replace it? As we realize that one half of our technology, and ultimately also of the nature to which it refers, previously defined in terms of pure efficiency and pure material essence, is in fact politically constructed, we must ask ourselves, where can we go from here? At one point, Latour's advice is to retain what I understand as the analytical acknowledgement of an external nature distinct from subjects, while, and this is interesting, using the pre-modern categories to conceptualize the hybrids that increasingly inhabit our world. This would seem to mean taking seriously the agency of objects, perhaps indeed to the point of reconsidering animism, while, and this is the modern contribution, keeping a clear view of the exact extent to which this agency is politically inscribed. Although Tim Ingold and Bruno Latour represent different disciplines and academic genres, there are some interesting parallels in their recent work, which suggests that they are in the process of unraveling similar arguments from quite different vantage points. Both are preoccupied with the dubious modern distinction between persons and objects, and between culture and nature. Both recognize that this distinction is paradoxically itself cultural, and both keep returning to the phenomenon of technology as an arena where the distinction becomes blurred, or at least problematic. If we are to reconsider animism, we need to discuss what this might imply, not only from an academic point of view, but also from a personal one. To the extent that we have never been modern, it could be argued that we probably all have treasured spaces in our lives where we are practicing animists, in the sense that engagement and relatedness take precedence over detached observation. The Cartesian program has raised our doubt from the start. Our disenchantment would never be as complete as Max Weber predicted. Philosophers like Martin Buber or Maurice Merleau-Ponty have explicitly encouraged us to retain our innate capacity to relate to the things around us. And to a greater extent than they feared would be possible, we probably have. As Latour suggests, modernity has not made us into quite the monsters that anti-modernists have imagined. To be sure, modern alienation and social disembeddedness are not conducive to relatedness, and are undoubtedly at the root of modernist epistemology. But all of us are actually born pre-modern, have an ontogenic familiarity with relatedness, and will generally tend to struggle to maintain some measure of community in our lives. Our training in the skills of modernist detachment and objectification is contextual, as illustrated by the professional logger who privately cares for his garden, or the industrial butcher who privately cares for his dog. The efficacy of modernity in unleashing wholesale transformations in human environmental relations lies in the creation of a spectrum of highly specialized occupations, each emphasizing its own specific application of objectification and detachment, so that the total impact of modern society is unrestricted by moral concerns, while each individual is able to maintain, by and large, a moral identity. In other words, it may not so much be an incapacity to relate as such that distinguishes us from the animists, as the incapacity to exercise such relatedness within the discursive and technical constraints of the professional subcultures which organize the most significant share of our social agency. Science and technology does not so much make us into robots as make specific parts of our behavior robot-like. Or does the difference indeed go deeper than this? Do modern people have a generalized tendency to perceive their environments as collections of objects? A compelling observation in this direction is Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's intriguing suggestion, published in 1999, that Europeans and Amerindians have diametrically opposite images of how humans and animals are constituted. Whereas Europeans tend to conceive of human beings as biological organisms masquerading in a cultural costume, Viveiros de Castro observes that Amazonian Indians view animals as fundamentally persons concealed under their animal surface. For Europeans, then, or at least for European biologists, living things are fundamentally objects, while for Amazonian Indians they are fundamentally subjects. The latter, of course, is an unusually concise statement of animism. But then, any one of us who has looked into the eyes of a dog or a cow would be prone to agree with the Amazonians. The Cartesian view of nature is obviously counterintuitive, even to the most ingrained modernist. A telling illustration of this is the classical example of the early European vivisectionists, who felt compelled to sever the vocal cords of the dogs whose living anatomy they explored. In effect, they could only perform their modernist task after having shut off the communicative link, the relation between dog and human. Would modernity be impossible in a world where living things are consistently recognized as subjects? Latour's answer seems to be yes. It is only by severing or submerging our capacity for relatedness that we are set free to impose our modernist designs on the world. Significantly, to make this point, he refers to Felipe de Scola's suggestion that traditional societies of Amazonia retain their relative inertia compared to Europe precisely because their conception of the non-human environment remains embedded in their moral conception of society. Animism, to de Scola, is the projection of social metaphors onto relations with the non-human world. In not separating nature and society, Amazonian Indians, like the Ashwar, automatically embed their ecological practice in a compelling moral system. For centuries, mainstream European society has refused to be thus constrained, and this liberation of capitalist modernity has been founded on the incommensurable distinction between nature and culture. Against this background, it seems ironic that calls are now being made for an environmental ethics. How, indeed, shall we be able to reintroduce morality into our dealings with our non-human environment, now that we have invested centuries of training and discourse into convincing ourselves that nature lies beyond the reach of moral concerns? So I'll post part 2, where I will hopefully finish the essay.